The late afternoon sun leaned gently against the tall glass windows of the boutique, turning the polished marble floor into a sheet of soft gold. Inside, the store was quiet, too quiet for a place that prided itself on exclusivity. Everything about it was designed to whisper luxury without ever needing to say the word out loud. The air smelled faintly of leather and cedar, and the display lights were angled so carefully that even the simplest watch looked like a museum piece. Behind the counter stood a young salesman named Robert Hale, straight-backed and perfectly dressed in a charcoal suit that still held the stiffness of new fabric. He had been told many times that presentation was everything. Appearance, posture, tone, these were the tools that separated an ordinary employee from someone destined for management. Robert believed that, more than believed it. He built his identity around it. He watched customers the way a gatekeeper watches a door deciding, often within seconds, who was worth his time. That afternoon had been slow. Only 2 serious buyers had walked in all day, both leaving with polite promises to come back later. Robert was growing restless. Commission days without sales felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Then the door opened. The chime was soft. Almost apologetic, a man stepped inside wearing a simple dark coat. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy. His shoes were clean but worn at the edges, the kind of wear that came from years of use rather than neglect. His hair was neatly combed, streaked with gray, and he carried himself with a calm, unhurried presence. He did not look like the store's usual customer. He did not look like money. Robert noticed immediately, and just as quickly. He made a decision. The man paused near the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the brightness of the showroom lights. He took a slow look around, not with the excitement of someone chasing status, but with the quiet appreciation of someone who noticed craftsmanship. He moved toward a display of vintage. TIMEPIECES. Steps were measured. Almost. Thoughtful, Robert stayed where he was, in training. They were taught to greet every customer within 10 seconds, but training fades when assumptions grow loud, after nearly half a minute. Robert finally approached, but not with the warm enthusiasm he used for obvious high spenders. His tone was polite, yes, but thin, professional, on the surface, dismissive underneath. "Can I help you?" he asked, hands folded in front of him. The man smiled soft, genuine. "I was hoping to take a closer look at that piece," he said, pointing to a classic gold watch resting on a velvet stand. Robert's eyes flicked to the price tag. It was one of the most expensive items in the case. For a brief moment, something sharp passed through his expression. Doubt, then judgment. "That model," Robert said carefully, "is part of our premium collection." The man nodded. "I can see that. It's quite an investment. I imagine it is." The man's voice remained calm, friendly without defensiveness. But Robert leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound confidential rather than rude. "Sir," he said, "most people who come in to view that piece usually schedule an appointment." There was a pause, a small, quiet pause, the kind where meaning settles into the space between words. The man did not react with offense. He simply looked at Robert with a patient expression, as if he had heard variations of this tone many times before. "I'm already here," he said gently. "Perhaps we can make an exception." Robert hesitated. For a split second, professionalism and prejudice wrestled inside him. Prejudice won. "That watch," Robert said, this time more directly, "is priced well beyond what most walk-in customers are prepared for." Another pause. The words hung in the air. Heavier now. The man's smile faded not into anger, but into something quieter, understanding not of the situation, of the assumption. "I see," he said softly. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he placed his hands behind his back and looked again at the watch, studying its details through the glass. The silence stretched long enough that Robert felt slightly uncomfortable, but pride kept him upright. Finally, the man spoke again. "It's beautifully made," he said. "You can tell someone cared when they designed it." Robert gave a short nod. Yes, it's one of our finest. And you believe I can't afford it? The question was asked without accusation, just clarity. Robert shifted his. Wait, I'm simply trying to save you time, he replied. The man let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh. Time, he repeated. That's the one thing none of us can buy more of. Robert did not respond, because something about the way the man said it calm. Reflective felt different from the usual defensive reactions he expected. The man straightened slightly. Adjusting his coat, would you mind opening the case? He asked again, still polite. Robert hesitated longer this time. Inside his mind, a checklist ran automatically: appearance, posture, clothing, likelihood of purchase. Every bias metric he had quietly learned without realizing it. And again, he made the wrong choice. I'm afraid, Robert said, forcing a professional smile, that this piece is reserved for qualified buyers. The words landed harder than he intended. Even he heard it. The man's eyes softened not with hurt, but with something closer to disappointment. Not in himself, in the moment. I understand, he said, and then he did something unexpected. He thanked him. You for your time, the man added gently. Robert nodded, relieved the interaction was ending. The man turned and began walking toward the exit. His steps were still calm, still unhurried. But this time, there was a subtle weight to them. Not anger, not humiliation, just quiet resignation, the kind that comes from being judged before being known. As he reached the door, it opened from the outside. The store manager entered. Mid-conversation on his phone, he stopped the moment he saw the man in the plain coat. His eyes widened. Shock flashed across his face so quickly. It was almost comical. He ended the call without a word. Sir, his voice changed. Instantly warm, respectful, almost reverent. Mr. Martin. I didn't realize you were here. Robert froze. The name echoed in his mind. Martin. Mr. Martin. The man in the plain coat turned slightly, offering a friendly nod. Good afternoon, he said. The manager stepped forward quickly, extending his hand with both of his. It's an honor, he said. We're grateful you stopped by. Robert's stomach dropped. A cold realization began to spread through his chest, slow, heavy, impossible. To ignore Martin, Dean Martin, the Dean Martin, the calm presence, the familiar voice, the effortless dignity. It all clicked at once. Robert's face drained of color, because in that instant, he understood something far worse than making a simple mistake. He had not just misjudged a customer, he had misjudged a man known around the world not only for fame, but for the quiet way he treated people. And suddenly, every word he had spoken replayed in his mind. Most people schedule an appointment, and beyond. What walking customers are prepared for? Reserved. For qualified buyers? Sentence now sounded harsher than he remembered. Saying it, the manager turned toward Robert slowly. What happened here? He asked. Robert opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Across from him, Dean Martin, still calm, still composed, gave a small, reassuring smile. It's all right, he said. Your employee was just doing his job. But there was something in his tone, not anger, not accusation, just a quiet truth. And that truth weighed heavier than any reprimand could. Because sometimes, the most powerful lesson is not delivered through shouting, but through grace. Robert felt his confidence crumble beneath him. For the first time that day, he truly saw the man he had judged. Not the coat, not the shoes, the man. And in that moment, he realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. You can measure wealth in many ways, but character is the one currency that never hides behind appearance. The boutique, once silent and comfortable, now felt unbearably loud with unspoken understanding, and Robert stood there, wishing more than anything that he could take back the first 10 seconds. Because sometimes, 10 seconds is all it takes to reveal who you really are. For several long seconds, no one in the boutique moved. The soft hum of the air conditioner suddenly felt louder than it should have. The golden light that once made the store look elegant now seemed almost harsh, exposing every expression, every hesitation, every unspoken thought. Robert could hear his own. Heartbeat slow, heavy, unforgiving. Across from him stood the man he had just dismissed, the same man that the entire world recognized with admiration. Dean Martin. Yet what unsettled Robert the most was not the name. It was the way Dean Martin carried himself. No anger. No pride. No demand for apology. Just calm. That calm felt heavier than any confrontation ever could. The manager stepped forward quickly, trying to recover the atmosphere that had already fractured. Double quotes, Mr. Martin, he said, with a respectful smile. Please allow me to personally assist you. Dean nodded politely, but his eyes briefly moved toward Robert, not accusing, not cold, just observant. And that quiet glance struck deeper than any harsh words. Robert felt something inside, because for the first time, he realized he wasn't being judged back. He was simply being seen, and somehow, that was worse. Dean returned his attention to the display case. The craftsmanship is impressive, he said, his tone thoughtful. You don't often see detailing like that anymore. The manager immediately unlocked the case and carefully lifted the gold watch, placing it on a soft velvet pad. Would you like to try it on? He asked. Dean hesitated for a moment, not out of doubt, but reflection. I would, he said, but only if it's all right with your colleague. The words landed like a quiet thundrclap. The manager blinked. Robert froze. Dean wasn't speaking to the manager. He was speaking about him, the very person who had just refused him. The manager turned slowly toward Robert, clearly expecting him to step forward. Robert's throat tightened. Every instinct in him wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. So he stepped closer. Each step felt heavier than the last. I'm sorry, sir, Robert managed to say, voice low. Dean looked at him not with superiority, but with patience. For what? Dean asked gently. The question caught Robert off guard, because it wasn't sarcastic. It was genuine. I shouldn't have assumed, Robert said. I judged too quickly. Dean held his gaze for a moment, long enough for the lesson to settle. Then he gave a small, understanding nod. We all do, he said quietly. Sometimes without realizing it. It was no lecture, no humiliation, just truth. And somehow, that made Robert feel the weight of his mistake even more deeply. Dean extended his hand toward the watch. Robert, with slightly trembling fingers, picked it up and placed it carefully into Dean's palm. The gold caught the light, reflecting warm tones across Dean's wrist as he fastened it. For a moment, the entire room seemed to pause. Dean studied the piece, not like a man checking a price, but like someone appreciating the story behind the object. It's not the gold that makes it valuable, he said softly. Robert listened. It's the hands that built it. Those words hung in the air, simple, but powerful, because suddenly the conversation was no longer about money. It was about respect, for work, for effort, for people. Dean turned his wrist slightly, watching how the light moved across the polished surface. Do you know, he continued, when I first started out, I used to walk into places where people wouldn't even look at me. Robert swallowed. Every word felt personal. I wore the same suit for years, Dean said. Not because I liked it, because it was the only one I had. The manager stood quietly. Understanding this was no longer a sales interaction. This was something deeper. People would decide who I was before I spoke. Dean added. Robert felt heat rise behind his eyes, not embarrassment alone, recognition, because he had just done the same thing. Dean slowly removed the watch and placed it back onto the velvet pad. It's a beautiful piece, he said. Truly. Robert hesitated. Would you like me to prepare it for purchase? He asked, voice careful. Dean looked at him, not evaluating the product, evaluating the moment. Then he smiled faintly. I haven't decided. Yet, he replied. The answer surprised everyone, including Robert, because this was not about whether he could afford it. It never was. A quiet tension filled the room again, not hostile, reflective. Dean walked a few steps toward the window. Looking out at the fading sunlight, he said, still facing away, the funny thing about success. He paused, is that it doesn't change who you are. Robert listened closely. It only reveals who you were becoming all along. Words settled deep, because they weren't aimed at anyone specifically, but they reached exactly where they needed to. Dean turned back toward them. His expression was warm again, almost fatherly. I don't mind being underestimated, he said calmly. It kept me hungry when I needed it. Robert lowered his gaze, but Dean added gently, some people walk through that door, carrying more than you can see. He glanced at the entrance. Bad days, hard work, dreams that took years just to keep alive. Robert's chest tightened, because now he understood this wasn't about a watch, it was about dignity. The boutique, once a place of quiet luxury, had become something else entirely. A classroom, without a teacher, because the lesson was coming from experience, not authority. Dean stepped closer to Robert, not to intimidate him, to meet him at eye level. What matters most, Dean said softly, is how we treat someone before we know who they are. Robert nodded slowly. That sentence alone felt like it would stay with him forever. The manager finally spoke again. Carefully, Mr. Martin, we would be honored to offer this piece to you at a preferred rate. Dean smiled politely. I appreciate that, he said. But that's not necessary. Another pause. Then he added, if I buy it, I'll pay the same as anyone else. The statement carried quiet integrity, no special treatment, no advantage, just fairness. Robert felt something shift inside him, the kind of shift that doesn't happen often, the kind that changes how a person sees the world, because for the first time that day, he wasn't looking at Dean Martin the celebrity. He was seeing Dean Martin, the man, a man who had every reason to demand respect, yet chose to teach it instead. Dean looked once more at the watch, then back at Robert. Tell me, he said gently, what do you like about this piece? The question stunned him. No one had ever asked his opinion during a sale. Robert hesitated, then answered honestly. The movement, he said. It's precise, reliable, built to last. Dean nodded. Approvingly, those are good qualities. Another pause. Then he added, in watches. In people. The words landed with quiet power. Robert felt them sink deep, because he understood what Dean was really saying. Character, consistency, respect, those were the true measures of value. Outside, the sun had almost set. Inside, the room felt different now. Softer, humbler, more human. Robert realized something he had never considered during all his training. Luxury wasn't about price. It was about how people felt when they walked through the door. And earlier, he had failed that test. Dean adjusted his coat, preparing to leave the display. I think, he said calmly. I'll take some time before deciding. The manager nodded respectfully. Of course. Dean turned toward Robert one last time, and instead of criticism, he extended his hand. Robert stared at it. Surprise, then quickly shook it. Dean's grip was firm, warm, genuine. Double quotes. Good to meet you. Dean said. Robert felt his throat tighten again. Good to meet you too. Sir, but this time there was no assumption in his voice. Only respect. As Dean Martin began to walk toward the exit, the boutique felt strangely lighter, yet the lesson he left behind felt permanent, because sometimes the most powerful Moments aren't loud. They don't come with applause. They arrive quietly and change someone forever. Robert watched the door close behind him, and in that silence, one truth echoed clearly in his mind: you never really know who someone is until you choose to treat them with respect first. And that day, he learned it from a man who didn't need to prove anything because his character had already done it for him. The next morning arrived slower than usual for Robert Hale. Sleep had not been rested, had been a long, restless replay of every word he wished he had never said. The boutique looked exactly the same as it always did. The polished marble floor still reflected the ceiling lights. The glass cases still shimmered with quiet elegance, and the scent of leather still hung faintly in the air. But to Robert, everything felt different, because now every corner of the room reminded him of the moment he had misjudged a man without even knowing his name. He arrived earlier than usual that day, earlier than the cleaning staff, earlier than the manager. He stood alone behind the counter, staring at the display where the gold watch rested perfectly centered on its velvet stand, as if nothing had ever happened. Yet to him, it looked heavier, not in weight, in meaning. He remembered Dean Martin's words: "What matters most is how we treat someone before we know who they are." The sentence echoed through his thoughts, like a quiet bell that refused to fade. By mid-morning, the store had opened. Customers came and went. Robert greeted each one differently now, warmer, more attentive, not because of fear of getting into trouble, but because something inside him had genuinely shifted for the first time since he started the job. He wasn't trying to predict who would buy. He was simply trying to treat people well. Still, beneath that new intention, there was tension, a quiet, persistent question: would Dean Martin ever come back? Robert wasn't sure which outcome frightened him more if he did, or if he didn't. Because if he never returned, Robert would carry that unfinished moment for the rest of his life. The afternoon. Sun began to stretch across the showroom windows, again the same golden hue as the day before, and then the door chimed soft, familiar. Robert looked up automatically, and his heart skipped. Dean Martin stood in the doorway, same simple coat, same calm posture, same quiet presence that filled the room without demanding. Attention time seemed to slow. Robert felt his pulse rise instantly, not from fear, from anticipation. This moment felt like a second chance. He wasn't sure he deserved. Dean stepped inside, glancing around with the same thoughtful curiosity as before. No entourage, no announcement, just him, the manager, who had been reviewing paperwork nearby, noticed immediately and approached with a respectful smile. "Mr. Martin, welcome back." Dean nodded warmly. "Good afternoon." This time, before the manager could say anything else, Dean's eyes moved toward Robert, and he walked straight toward him. Each step felt deliberate, unhurried, confident. Robert's single quotes. Throat tightened, because this wasn't avoidance. This was intention. Dean stopped in front of him. "Good to see you again," he said. Simplicity of the greeting caught Robert off guard. No mention of yesterday. No reference to the mistake. Just acknowledgement. "Good to see you too, sir," Robert replied, voice steadier than he expected. Dean glanced toward the display case. "I've been thinking about that watch," he said. A small wave of suspense moved through Robert's chest. Was he here to buy it? Or to make a point? "I'd like to see it again," Dean added. This time, Robert didn't hesitate even for a second. He unlocked the case immediately, lifting the watch with careful hands and placing it gently on the velvet pad. His movements were respectful, not because of who Dean was, but because of what he had learned. Dean picked up the watch and studied it once more. The light danced across the gold surface. Reflecting warm tones onto his wrist, he turned it slowly, Examining the details, silence filled the space, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was focused, intentional. After a long moment, Dean spoke. "Yesterday," he said calmly, "you told me most people schedule appointments to view this piece." Robert felt the words land like a quiet test. "Yes, sir," he answered honestly. Dean nodded. "That's good policy." The response surprised him. There was no criticism in it, only acknowledgement. But policies, Dean continued, should never replace kindness. Robert swallowed. Because that line struck deeper than any reprimand. "Dean, set the watch down again. Tell me something," he said gently. Robert met his eyes. "What made you think I couldn't afford it?" The question wasn't sharp. It was curious, and that made it harder to answer. Robert took a slow breath. "My training," he admitted. "I was taught to identify likely buyers quickly." Dean tilted his head slightly. "And what did you identify?" Robert hesitated, then chose honesty over comfort. "I saw your coat," he said. "Your shoes. And I assumed," the word hung in the air. "Assumed." Dean nodded once. "That happens a lot," he said quietly. He rested his hand lightly on the counter. "Do you know," he continued, "some of the wealthiest men I've ever met look like they had nothing." Robert listened closely. "And some of the loudest spenders," Dean added, "were drowning in debt." The truth in his voice was unmistakable, because it wasn't philosophy, it was experience. Dean picked up the watch again, but this time, instead of examining it, he held it out toward Robert. "You try it on?" Robert blinked, confused. "Sir?" "Go ahead," Dean said, reluctantly. Robert slipped the watch onto his wrist. The weight surprised him. It felt solid, precise, important. Dean watched him carefully. "How does it feel?" he asked. Robert searched for the right word. "Reliable," he said. Dean smiled. "Slightly. That's the feeling people come here for. Not status, not bragging rights. Reliability, confidence, trust." Dean then said something Robert would never forget. "If someone walks into your store," he said softly, "they're not just buying a watch." Robert listened. "They're buying how you make them feel." The sentence settled deep, because suddenly, every past interaction replayed in Robert's mind. Times he had rushed people, judged people, dismissed people. Moments he had never considered important, but now they felt enormous. Dean gently removed the watch from Robert's wrist and placed it back on the velvet. Then he reached into his coat. For a brief second, Robert felt a spike of suspense. Dean pulled out a simple leather wallet, worn but well kept. He opened it calmly and placed a card on the counter. "I'll take it," he said. The words were quiet, but they hit like thunder. The manager straightened. Instantly, Robert's hands almost froze. Not because of the sale, but because of what it represented. This wasn't victory, it was trust, given after a mistake. As the manager prepared the paperwork, Dean looked back at Robert. "This isn't about the watch," he said. Gently, Robert nodded. "I know." Dean studied his face for a moment, then added, "It's about what you do with your next customer." That line carried more weight than the purchase itself, because it made one thing clear: the real test wasn't yesterday, it wasn't today. It was every day that would follow. When the transaction was complete, the watch was placed into an elegant box. Dean accepted it with a small nod of gratitude. No celebration, no drama, just quiet closure. He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back one last time. "Everyone deserves a fair first moment," he said. Robert felt those words settle deep into his chest, because that was exactly what he had taken from Dean the day before. A fair first moment. Dean opened the door and stepped outside into the fading light. The chime sounded. Again, soft final. The boutique returned to silence. But it was no longer the same silence as before. This one carried meaning, growth. Jaw changed. Robert stood still for several seconds. Then he looked down at the empty space. in the display case, and for the first time in his career he understood something no training manual had ever taught him. Sales wasn't about products, it was about people, and respect was the most valuable thing he could ever offer that evening. As the store closed, Robert realized something powerful. Yesterday had been his worst moment. Today had become his most important lesson. And sometimes the person who teaches you the most is the one you almost fail to see at all. Winter arrived quietly that year. The city outside the boutique changed first. The air grew sharper. Footsteps became quicker, and the golden afternoon light that once warmed the showroom now slipped away earlier each day. Inside, however, the store remained almost the same. Polished floors, soft music, glass cases glowing under careful lighting. But one thing had changed permanently, Robert. Months had passed since the day Dean Martin first walked through the door in that simple coat. Yet not a single shift went by without Robert remembering that moment. Not as a wound, as a turning point. The way he greeted people had transformed completely. He no longer scanned shoes or jackets. He no longer tried to calculate who was worth his time. Now, every customer, whether confident or hesitant, was met with the same calm welcome. And something unexpected began to happen. Sales increased. Not dramatically at first, but steadily. Because people stayed longer. They smiled more. They trusted him. The manager noticed it. Other employees noticed it. But Robert knew the truth. It wasn't technique. It was respect. One cold evening, just before closing, the boutique was nearly empty. The lights had already dimmed slightly, signaling the end of the day. Robert was adjusting a display when the door chimed. Soft, familiar. He looked up instinctively. And for a moment, he thought his memory was playing tricks on him. Dean Martin stood in the doorway again. Same calm posture. Same quiet presence. But this time, there was something different. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood an older man, wearing a modest coat that looked far too light for the winter cold. His hands were rough, the kind shaped by years of physical work. The man seemed hesitant, almost unsure if he belonged inside. Dean placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, a reassuring gesture. Robert felt a ripple of curiosity and suspense. Why was he here? Good evening, Robert said, stepping forward. Dean nodded warmly. Good evening. The older man gave a small, respectful nod, avoiding eye contact with the displays. Dean spoke calmly. My friend here has never owned a proper watch, he said. Robert glanced at the man's wrist. Bare. I told him this was the best place to find one, Dean added. The words carried quiet trust. And suddenly, Robert understood this moment was not random. It was intentional. Of course, Robert said gently, turning toward the older man. What kind of watch would you like? The man hesitated. I don't need anything expensive, he said softly. Just something that works. Those words echoed the same humility Dean himself had carried months earlier. Robert smiled, not the polished sales smile, but a genuine one. Something reliable, he said. The man nodded. Yes. Robert led them to a section with simpler, beautifully crafted pieces watches that were elegant without being extravagant. He opened the case carefully and placed one on the velvet pad. This one is precise, he explained. Built to last. The older man looked at it with quiet wonder, almost disbelief. Can I? Try it, he asked. Robert nodded warmly. Of course. He helped fasten it gently around the man's wrist. The man stared at it for several seconds, as if he wasn't looking at a watch, but at something he never thought he would have. Dean watched silently from the side, his expression calm, observant. Proud not of the purchase, but of the moment unfolding. How does it feel? Robert asked. The man swallowed. Feels. Important, he said quietly. Robert nodded. That's because your time is important. The sentence slipped out naturally, not rehearsed, not calculated. It's just true. Dean's eyes softened, because that was the lesson he had hoped would remain. The man began to remove the watch. Oh no, he said quickly. I can't afford this. Robert shook his head gently. Let's not decide that yet, he replied. Dean stepped forward. I invited him, he said calmly. I'll take care of it. The older man looked shocked. No, I can't let you, Dean placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You've spent your whole life taking care of others, he said. Let someone take care of you for once. The man's eyes filled with emotion he tried hard to hide. As the manager prepared the purchase, Robert felt a quiet realization settle in his chest. Months ago, he had been the barrier. Now he was part of the welcome. And that difference meant everything. Dean turned toward Robert. You handled that well, he said. Robert shook his head slightly. I learned from the best, he replied. Dean gave a soft chuckle. No, he said. You learned because you wanted to. That distinction mattered. Because change forced by embarrassment fades, change chosen with humility lasts. The purchase was completed. The watch was placed carefully into a simple box. But Dean did something unexpected. He handed the box not to himself, to Robert. Would you give it to him? He asked. Robert nodded. He stepped toward the older man and placed the box gently into his hands. The man held it like it was something fragile and priceless. Thank you, he whispered. Not just to Dean, to Robert too. As they turned to leave, Dean paused at the door. The winter air slipped in briefly, carrying a chill. He looked back one last time. Remember, he said calmly, a store doesn't become great because of what it sells. Robert listened closely. It becomes great because of how people feel when they walk out. The words settled deep. Because now Robert understood that was the real luxury. Not gold, not price tags, dignity. The door closed. The chime echoed softly. And just like that, Dean Martin was gone again. But this time, he didn't leave behind a mistake. He left behind proof that the lesson had worked. Months later, Robert would often think about that night, about the man with rough hands staring at his first real watch, about the quiet pride in his eyes, and he realized something powerful. Wealth is not measured by what you can buy. It's measured by what you choose to give. Respect, patience, kindness, second chances. Years passed. Robert eventually became the store's manager, not because he was the best salesman, but because customers trusted him. And trust is the rarest currency in any business. On his first day as manager, he placed a small note inside the employee training folder. It read, "Never decide someone's worth in the first 10 seconds. No signature. No explanation. Just truth." Sometimes new employees would ask where the rule came from. Robert would simply smile and say, "From someone who taught me what real wealth looks like." Never needed to say the name. Because the lesson was bigger than the person. And somewhere in quiet memory, the image remained. A man in a simple coat, standing calmly in a luxury store, proving without ever trying that character will always outshine appearance. Because in the end, the most powerful kind of success isn't being recognized when you walk into a room. It's leaving behind a change that remains long after you're gone. And that night, Dean Martin didn't just buy a watch. He gave a man a new way to see the world. A kind of wealth that never fades.